like filed the same lawsuit in the same court, but had two cases. Right. Can you think of an issue where we got it on the same side? Oh, actually, Title IX. Possibly. Title IX, possibly. Where the ACLU is not as fully on the, like, it's a little bit more Title IX issue.
What about Georgia banning the free speech zones on college campuses? The ACLU is against the
I can't see anything.
Well, yeah, I think
We're good?
If so,
ACLU in Georgia.
that seems crazy. I think I would have known about it. That seems really crazy. No. We're making the same position too. Whatever your position is on free speech zones, that's the right way.
Yep. Good evening. How is everybody? Good. It's been quite a week. So welcome. And welcome to the National Liberty Museum. My name is Elaine Arnott, and I'm the president and CEO here at the museum. And it is my distinct privilege to open tonight's Voices and Votes program, an event dedicated to exploring one of our democracy's most cherished and contested freedoms, free speech. This year holds special significance for us as we as a museum are celebrating our 25th anniversary. Yay! For over a quarter of a century, we've been a place where the ideals of liberty come alive through powerful stories, thought-provoking exhibitions, and genuine, meaningful dialogue. And tonight, in the spirit of fostering open and robust dialogue, we're excited to welcome representatives from FIRE, ACLU, and PEN America, organizations tirelessly dedicated to promoting and expanding First Amendment freedoms. They each bring a unique perspective on how to balance the right to speak freely with the responsibility to engage in respectful, constructive dialogue. And to guide this conversation, we are honored to have Mike Pesca as our moderator. Mike is the host of The Gist, a podcast renowned for its in-depth analysis of current events, thoughtful interviews, and lively discussions, which tonight will be no exception. He brings a wealth of journalistic expertise and a passion for nuanced debate, qualities we believe are essential for an event that seeks to illuminate rather than simplify the complexities surrounding free speech. And at the National Liberty Museum, we strive not only to celebrate liberty, but also to cultivate spaces where we can wrestle with its challenges, where visitors of all ages, backgrounds, and opinions are encouraged to think critically, share openly, and listen actively. Our mission is to build a society that champions freedom of thought, respects human dignity, and pursues liberty in all of its forms. So as you take part in tonight's Voices and Votes program, we encourage you to join in the conversation. Ask your pressing questions and reflect on how individual voices from your local community to the national platforms shape our democracy. Thank you again for joining us on this special occasion as we look back on 25 years of championing liberty and look ahead to what we can achieve together. We hope you leave tonight inspired to carry forward the profound responsibility that accompanies freedom. So with that, I want you to welcome our panelists and our moderator, and we're going to get the night started and have a great conversation. So welcome. Mike.
Do it. Excellent. Thank you so much. This is the first time I've been to the National Liberty Museum, but it is not and I encourage you, if you are in or near Philadelphia or in and near a Liberty state of mind, definitely come down and check it out. I walked around this museum earlier today because I wanted to imbibe and experience the spirit of liberty. Also, I was looking for the bathroom. But I went to so many exhibits, and it's just amazing. They're interactive. I think they work on a lot of levels. Just a high quality of curation. And I realized, as I was doing this, this is not, though this is the first National Liberty Museum I've been to, this is not the first time I've been to a Liberty or First Amendment museum. I found myself in vacation in Maine, and I took the kids to the First Amendment Museum at the capital of Maine. And the capital of Maine is what? Augusta, very good for the steel. And there, it's just a guy who had a house and likes the First Amendment. So He put up a picture of Edward Snowden. He put up a picture of Gandhi. Don't know what the First Amendment exact relationship is, but he had, there was a printout of the First Amendment. We all love the First Amendment, right? And I went to an upstairs room, and this is what gives that museum. And listen, the National Liberty Museum really blows it away in every way. I'm not going to compare museums, but they did have this. They did have a printout of the actual evidence in a Supreme Court case, a printout that said, "Bong hits for Jesus." Do you guys know this case?
Yeah, it was our case.
It was the ACLU's case. It was a famous case in Alaska. The vice, was it Dan Quayle? A major political figure was coming through Alaska, and some kid holds up a sign that says, "Bong hits for Jesus," and it becomes a First Amendment case. Are you allowed to say that? I'm not.
Unfortunately for him, it was during a school day.
It was, yeah, these are the important things, right? And so was it a separation of church and state issue? No.
It was a question of whether the school could discipline you for off-campus conduct that occurred during a school day while under school supervision.
So
that encouraged illegal drug use.
I had read about this, but until you see the sign printed out on a dot matrix printer, you can't really understand the issue. And I will say that the fact that I tell this anecdote to anyone and they laugh when I say "Bong hits for Jesus" makes it, in my mind, a fairly simple First Amendment case. The other First Amendment cases, I don't know, Brandenburg and endorsing the Nazis, people wouldn't laugh. So let's talk about not just the First Amendment and not just free speech, but the difficult cases, what's going on now, and let's talk about it as I introduce my panel. I have right here to my left Aaron Turr. He is the Director of Public Advocacy at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. FIRE, he's done work for every outlet under the sun, including NPR and the New York Post, graduate of UVA Law School and Vassar, and the man is a Philadelphian. Say hello to Aaron Turr. Next to Aaron, we have Summer Lopez, who is the Chief Program Officer of the Free Expression Programs at PEN America. She oversees PEN America's advocacy, research, and programming in defense of free expression in the U.S. and globally. Globally, you say, what qualifies her to do that? Well, she has lived and worked in Zimbabwe, Egypt, Nepal, India, Ghana. The list goes on and on. Harvard and Princeton or some of her schools. Say hello to Summer Lopez. And on the end, the man who tried so faithfully to defend the Bong hits for Jesus kids, doing the Lord's work literally, he's the director of the ACLU's Speech Privacy and Technology Project, which works to protect and expand the First Amendment. I should tell you that since 2013, Ben has been the principal legal advisor to NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden. He's a Harvard and NYU Law School guy. Say hello to Ben Wisner.
Close enough.
Wisner. Ben Wisner. So, I was downstairs in one of these exhibits, and there is a prompt, and they say, what is a time that you had an unpopular opinion that you were, and what was the consequence of this unpopular opinion? So unpopular opinion 1 will lead off the questioning. Someone wrote, when TikTok was banned, everyone, parentheses, adults, said it should have been banned sooner. That's it, that's the whole thing. Anyway, let's talk about TikTok. This is a First Amendment issue. This is a free speech issue. It's also an issue of some other things. Aaron, tell me what you and FIRE think about the TikTok ban. What are the implications for free speech?
Yeah, I would say we didn't think that it should have been banned sooner or at all.
And you are adults.
And we are, yeah, we are adults. I'm the one adult there, but no. Yeah, we are adults. And so, yeah, so Congress passed this law that required TikTok to divest from its parent company, ByteDance, which is located in China, or else effectively be banned from operating in the United States. And FIRE and I believe the ACLU filed amicus briefs in this case. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court, arguing that this law violates the First Amendment because it essentially effectively bans an entire platform for speech that is used by 170 million Americans. So it's not just affecting the rights of TikTok, which TikTok itself is a company based in the United States, which has its own rights as a speaker and a host of speech. And then
even if it wasn't, to interrupt, if it was the BBC, would that change things much?
The BBC, so if you're not located within the United States borders, you don't have your own. The First Amendment doesn't protect your speech, but it may protect the rights of Americans to hear your speech.
Right,
So
right.
kind of two sides of the same coin. You have the right to speak and the right to receive ideas and information under the First Amendment. But the people using TikTok, right, it affects their First Amendment right to use the platform that they want to use to get their message out and spread their ideas and views. So unfortunately, the Supreme Court did not agree with our perspective and upheld the law in a 9-0 decision, so it didn't go well for us. But I take issue with the decision that the court issued, which, by the way, was sort of a rush decision. So they decided that they were going to. It was on an expedited schedule, where normally a Supreme Court take a year to decide a case, but they basically decided this case in about a month from briefing to the decision day, because they wanted to issue an opinion before the ban took effect on January 19th. So that resulted in kind of a rush decision. The court even acknowledged that in the opinion. And I think one of the mistakes that the court made was saying that this isn't a content-based law. It's not targeting TikTok on the basis of the content on the platform, which is a grave First Amendment sin if the government's doing that, right? It's kind of the worst thing the government can do is say, we're going to limit your speech because of the content of what you're saying or the viewpoint that you're expressing. But so the court said, well, the government has a separate justification that's about protecting the data privacy of Americans that use the app, because TikTok, like other social media platforms, collects data from users, and then it can use that to tune its algorithm. And then the fear is that its parent company, ByteDance in China, could be forced by the Chinese government to turn that data over to the Chinese government, and then they might use it in some way that threatens our national security. But the government was also very clear that one of its main justifications for the law was fear about the viewpoints and information, ideas, and so-called propaganda that are circulating on the platform, and that they didn't want American citizens to be exposed to, because it might persuade us to be pro-China or increase division among the American populace. But again, the government, if there's anything that First Amendment stands for, it's that the government has no authority to control the information environment within the United States, because it doesn't like the mix of information and ideas that Americans have the right to consume and evaluate for themselves.
So some of the lay defenders of the law did point out and did say that TikTok is engaged, or the Chinese control, ByteDance, is engaged in propagandizing through TikTok. And an example that they point to is the amount of anti-Israeli or pro-Palestinian content that wound up on that app versus other apps. So that would be an example where it's based on content to try to ban them. But my question is, was that just people in Congress saying it, or did the court, was that actually brought up before the Supreme Court, the content of TikTok?
It was a lot of lawmakers that supported the act said things like that, but it's also shot through the government's briefing, both in the D.C. Circuit and before the Supreme Court. But the way they tried to spin it is, it's not really about the content or the viewpoints, it's just about not allowing the Chinese government to be able to manipulate the content on the platform. But of course, the only reason they're concerned about that manipulation is because of the particular viewpoints that they think that the Chinese government would promote or demote on the platform.
So Ben,
I want to say, everything he said is absolutely right, but he's left out another dimension to it, which is that it's very funny that Congress banned TikTok and every young person in the world is now praising Donald Trump for restoring TikTok. And yes, even though banning it was originally his idea, but I'm not generally impressed by national security arguments of any kind. So I'm putting that bias on the table.
Snowden guy says so.
Correct.
Yeah.
But here, it is funny to think of a bunch of Chinese generals sitting around a table saying, what if we mesmerize all of Americans into utter stupidity by just having a perfect algorithm that keeps them on there all day? And I ask my college student nieces, where do you get your news? And they're like, well, the New York Times is on TikTok. It's like literally they spend their entire day on this platform and like needed their fix during the 2
Yes.
days that it was cut off. So maybe there is a security.
Or maybe the generals are trying out the different dances with each other to see which one is most fire.
I mean, one day they can flip a switch and we won't be able to find any information about Taiwan. Fine.
Yes.
But like the truth is, we have always consumed and produced propaganda. The United States is an unbelievable purveyor of propaganda around the world. And, you know, from the Cold War on, the Supreme Court has made clear that we have a right to receive propaganda, including propaganda generated by the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War. So it was a very shabby decision by the Supreme Court. I think the thing we need to worry about now from a free speech perspective is, what does someone like Donald Trump do in this situation? Obviously, he's going to try to manipulate the situation so that TikTok becomes either his property or his political organ. So it's either going to be some way that he personally enriches himself through whatever the sale is, or it's going to be some way that it gets pushed to a crony so that it becomes another mouthpiece for the administration. So that's what I would watch out for.
Yeah, Summer, you're going to say.
I was just going to add too, I mean, I think, you know, even if you do give some validity to some of the concerns, particularly on the sort of surveillance and use of data side of things, I mean, the solution is to actually pass comprehensive privacy legislation that would protect Americans using all sorts of different platforms rather than this sort of sledgehammer approach here. And I think, you know, the other piece that we also have argued, and we also were part of, I think, a different amicus on this one, if I remember correctly, is also that it sets a really alarming precedent for other governments to see the United States ban an entire social media platform, which is something authoritarians love to do and want to be able to say, look at what the US did, and, you know, this is a completely reasonable thing for me as Putin or whoever else to shut down part of the internet, to constrain people's access to a platform of information and expression. And as an organization that represents, you know, writers and more the creative community, TikTok is an incredibly important platform for creative expression. And so to really, you know, to have the US government be in a position to be shutting that down, I think is quite alarming.
Right. So to play devil's advocate and talk about the Chinese Communist Party, maybe it's a more literal phrase than usual, the authoritarians do like banning platforms and speech, but in this case is banning the speech of other authoritarians. And is there no justification or no point to having an adversarial government exert control over a ubiquitous media platform that, and to say it is an unacceptable risk within our borders? So this might not be the First Amendment portion of it. This is the national security portion, Ben, which you say you're not that impressed by. But this does describe what's going on with TikTok, does it not? I mean, they mine data, like they will mine the data of interpersonal communications more so than X mines data, or Meta, or the other social media platforms.
It's just very rich because we're a country that, as Summer pointed out, we're the only Western democracy that does not have any comprehensive consumer privacy law. So basically all the data that they get through TikTok, they could purchase on the open market and probably already have anyway through the rest of the, you know, tech platforms that have it, right? So it's not as if they have extra special unique access to American data through TikTok. It's like it's out there literally for anybody. So that's why, again, I don't find that so persuasive. And I think what I will say is there's a cost to having an open society, right? So that is what I will concede to you, which is that if you have an open society, it's open to your adversaries. If you have transparency for your people, it's transparent to your adversaries. There's no way to share information with citizens of a country now without sharing it with the entire world, including people who are trying to do you harm. And so, yeah, so this is one cost of having an open society. And the solution, there are no solutions, but the better response to it is to have a more resilient and less idiotic citizenry.
Yeah, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. I believe that. What about this? And this isn't necessarily a First Amendment issue, but Donald Trump, in saying, I'm not going to institute the law, did something clearly lawless, did he not? He ignored a law passed by Congress just based on his own whim or fiat. There were elements in the law saying if TikTok had a buyer, you can engage in that. But I'm not necessarily, and I've talked to a flaming liberal and a flaming conservative this week who are both very upset by saying Congress passed the law and Donald Trump's deciding not to implement it. But again, I don't even know if it's First Amendment-y, but you guys are brilliant lawyers. Tell me what you think.
Yeah, so he issued this executive order that basically said that he's not going to have the Department of Justice or the Attorney General enforce the law for 75 days, I think. And I think there was something in the law too that said so what the law actually does is ban companies that would provide hosting services to TikTok from doing that, or else they face massive penalties and fines. And basically saying that if they do that, it won't be considered a violation of the act. Now, yeah, so this is a little outside the scope of my area especially, so take it with a grain of salt. But I did read an article by someone who is
stay in a Holiday Inn Express.
Yeah, it is a law professor who I think is an expert in this area, and he was saying that it's very risky for the companies like Oracle, the hosting companies, to rely on that executive order because what could happen is later on maybe the Trump administration changes its mind and then does impose the penalties for them violating the act during this time period, or maybe the statute of limitations, I think, is 5 years, so you could even get into the next administration and they decide retroactively to impose the penalties, and that they may not be able to rely on the assurance given in the executive order because it's not enough that that the government says we're not going to enforce this. They also have to give assurances that the conduct's actually legal and that it was reasonable for the individual violating the law to rely on that assurance. And I think it's pretty clear, though, that Oracle is violating the text of the law if they provide the services, as well as the same thing for the other hosting companies. So those companies may not be able to argue, big, sophisticated corporations that they are with access to high-powered legal counsel, that they reasonably relied on this assurance that was obviously they were violating the act, and so they may still be on the hook for massive penalties. I think it's something like $5,000 per user per day, I think. So that could quickly go up into trillions of dollars after a couple of months.
Yeah. So I'll put a button on this part of the discussion. We started by reading, give me an opinion that you shared and the consequences you face. I'll read just another one from that board. Many people give me a hard time about not liking cheese. I think cheese is gross and smells terrible. So let's move on to meta and disinformation. I think this is what's interesting to me about, there are a couple interesting things about Mark Zuckerberg getting out of the fact-checking game and doing so. Interesting thing one, wearing the mantle of free speech. We are now not fact-checking. We are now not applying the same community standards about what insults you could lob at people. And in doing so, he said, and his supporters said the words and phrase free speech over and over again. I could see why he would want to posit that that's what he's doing, and he'd want to position what he's doing in that way. For political reasons, we know the current president has said that that is his definition of free speech, and also to put the most positive sheen on what he's doing. But do any of you folks think that there is a risk in defining free speech in the way as we're not going to moderate the content on our private service? Summer, what do you think?
I mean, I think he announced several different things at one time, right? So I think the fact-checking thing is probably the most unequivocally problematic from my perspective, because fact-checking is actually the professional third-party fact-checking programs that they've been utilizing. What evidence we actually have, because the platforms are very opaque and it's often hard to know, suggests it's actually quite effective, that when decisions made by the fact checkers are appealed, they're overturned a very small percentage of the time. That's not at all true of all the things that are moderated in other ways on the platform. It's also not necessarily the case that that content is usually taken down. It's usually given a filter or a label or something. Right. So it's actually a relatively free speech friendly way of addressing disinformation on the platform. So, I mean, our perspective at Penn is that there are free speech friendly ways to address some of the content on the platforms that is problematic and that can be detrimental, and disinformation, online abuse. You know, these are things that we do feel need to be addressed in some way. They are themselves problematic from a free expression perspective. And so, you know, they sort of pollute the ability to have a reasoned conversation in these spaces. But you've really taken away one of the more effective tools that we have. and also taken away more of the automated moderation, which, you know, I think is deeply flawed for sure. But you've kind of taken away both some of the human and the automated moderation and replaced it with basically nothing.
Nothing, and you call it free speech.
Right, except for the user reporting mechanisms, which we actually wrote an entire report on how those don't basically work. They're extremely challenging to be effective at all. And there are also lots of countries in which people won't use reporting mechanisms of any kind because they fear sort of being retaliated against in some way or exposing them in some way to their own repressive governments. So, you know, we do believe that there should be some form of moderation on the platforms. Otherwise, you kind of end up with this cesspool overtaken by bots, and, you know, we can kind of see what's happened to X as a result of that. It doesn't actually generate an environment for free speech. It generates an environment in which kind of the loudest and most extreme voices drown out all the others. So, you know, I think that there's different. And then there was also, you know, the policies around hate speech that seemed to get loosened. And what's interesting, I think, about those is that it seems, and again, it's hard to know for sure because of the opacity, but it seems that those policies were really only loosened in relation to gender identity and sexuality and not to other categories of hate speech, which would suggest to me that it's not really about free speech, that it's really about politics, right? These are sort of the identities and communities that are at the center of a lot of the attacks right now. Obviously, they're also at the center of some of the EOs we've seen come out. And so that looks to me like it's not really about a principled argument. It's really about cozying up to a particular political perspective in this moment. And certainly some of the language I think that he used in rolling it out. He also kind of discredited fact checkers in doing so, which I thought was quite concerning, and you know, so I did not take it as a principled and credible, real defense of free speech. Even though I think there are concerns about some of the moderation in the way that it's worked thus far. It shuts down a lot of things that we do feel should be able to be on the platforms too. So.
Right. So Aaron, I'll call on you next, and in doing so, I guess I can be accused of threatening Ben's free speech because I'm moderating. But go ahead.
I have a little bit of a different perspective on it. I think I don't dispute that the timing of it and is very suspect, and there are legitimate concerns that this is just kind of an attempt to curry favor with the new administration, and you hope that they're not just kind of swing the pendulum in the other way, but I think if we just put that aside for the moment and just look at the policy changes on their face, I don't think it's accurate to say that they're getting rid of fact checking. They're just instituting a new model that is apparently going to be based off of X's community notes model. So it's sort of a crowdsourced version of fact checking I think there is some merit to, and there is some research showing that it can be highly effective and accurate. And so the idea is that you also append notes to posts that may contain false information, but in order for those notes to materialize, there has to be sort of a consensus across reviewers with diverse political and ideological perspectives. So you get kind of a cross-partisan consensus that something is incorrect. It's less likely to be infected by potential bias of the fact checkers themselves, which has been a concern for a while with some of these, single organization third-party fact checkers that. And even if it's mostly just in the minds or perception of people, that's still kind of a problem too, right? Because fact checking is only going to work if people actually trust that information and trust the fact checkers, right? Or else, and I think we've seen over the last several years that there has been a marked decline in trust in fact checking, and that it's often kind of just shrugged off as kind of partisan nonsense. Right. And I don't wholly endorse that myself. I think there's some evidence of that. I can give a couple of examples that I've seen from some of the notable fact-checking organizations where they fact-checking, that's something kind of arguable or maybe more of a matter of opinion. But anyway, they're switching the community notes model, and we'll see how that works out. But I would just point that out so that they're not completely abandoning the idea of fact-checking, but they want to approach it in this different way. And then
you could do both. There's no reason you couldn't have both.
But the other thing I would point out with the crowdsourced fact checking is that it just real quick, it's not it's actually not a complete either or, because the community notes often cite and rely on expert commentary and credible sources. So there's kind of they kind of interplay with each other. So it's not just, a bunch of average Joes like, oh, this is what I think about this. The community note is more likely to stay there and be highly rated if it cites high quality sources.
Yeah, well, just a couple of points. One is, Summer, you said that it's only on gender issues that the rules have changed about what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. I think to some extent, you're right. I think that they have, and this was reported by The Intercept and Casey Newton, but there are certain words, certain insults, slang words for transsexual people that used to just get you banned, and now you're allowed to say it. And that is the only category of those kind of words that are now acceptable. But there's different phrases that you could now use about all sorts of races that you used to not be able to use. So it's not a word that is now off the verboten list. So I just wanted to say that. And the other thing is, from what I understand, and I interviewed Kate Klonick about this, and she's written more about the Facebook board, their Supreme Court, than anyone else. I think they only had 17 fact checks a day. So it's not as if Facebook or Meta was so shot through with fact checking, and everything that a fact checker ever got wrong somehow showed up on Facebook. I think they were very judicious about this. And I also think, even though we can cite famous examples of fact checking not getting it right, that actually didn't happen with Facebook. Not that fact checking is perfect, but it was mostly good, but also de minimis, if I use my Latin right. But Ben,
well, so I just want to make sure that, this conversation does require some nuance. Everything that you all have been talking about is normative and not legal. You've been talking about free speech.
Because it's a private
You've been talking about free speech culture, not free speech law. And I think all of our organizations would agree that the platforms can have whatever content moderation rules they want, and we would defend that as a First Amendment associational right. We would go to court and say that Facebook could have whatever rules that it wants for moderation. Now, as a matter of policy, we care. We don't care about a yarn enthusiast site that has 2,000 members. We don't care about their moderation rules. We don't care about a car auction site's moderation rules. We care about Facebook because it has 2 billion users. We care about the former Twitter because it's where all the political journalists are and where people go to get a lot of political news and information. And so for that reason, all of our organizations have taken policy positions about what kind of content moderation rules they have. But I just wanted to be clear that what we're really talking about here is free speech culture and not First Amendment law.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And also, I would to add on to that, there is some concern about the new administration jawboning platforms or pressuring platforms to abandon fact checking. And for example, the new FCC chairman sent a threatening letter to social media platforms about their relationship with a particular fact checking organization. NewsGuard.
Which is excellent, in my opinion, but also true.
Yeah, and so that, like Ben said, we're talking about free speech culture issues, but those First Amendment issues, when the government gets involved, and I think that is more important. And whatever you think about the wisdom of using a particular fact-checking organization, yes, it's absolutely the right of a private platform to be able to make those sort of editorial choices, and the government should not be swooping in and trying to substitute its judgment for the editorial discretion of the platforms.
But you're right, and this panel is about not just the government, not just literal violations of the First Amendment, but the ethic of the First Amendment, the ethic of free speech. Do you think that has been degraded? Do you think this latest decision, is where the question started, Zuckerberg or others defining, hey, if you tell me that my platform can't allow anything, that what you're doing is you're suppressing my free speech, does that represent a degradation in people's understanding, or what should be people's understanding of the ethic of free speech?
Yeah, look, we will get to this. Almost everyone thinks that they understand what the free speech is and that they support it. And both of those things are wrong for almost everyone. They don't understand what it is and they don't support it.
But it is good that they think that. Isn't it good that they think that?
I don't know. What I want to say specifically on misinformation before we dig deeper into people's misconceptions is, there is research on this. I think, in 2016, there were these traumas that shook elite liberals, myself included, Brexit and the Trump election, and people were really grasping around for explanations. And so it was the Russians, or it was the platforms, and it must have been Facebook, and it must have been this, and sort of since then there's been this, I think, deep-seated hope and belief among progressives that if only we had better information hygiene, those people would realize that they shouldn't vote for Trump. And the truth is that the research on this doesn't bear that out. The research on misinformation online is that it is much more a demand problem than a supply problem. By which I mean it is overwhelmingly consumed by people who are seeking it out, not who receive it passively and get persuaded by it. And if you were a Democrat between 2016 and 2020, you experienced this with Russiagate, where no one really cared about the details, whether this happened or that. You had already decided that Trump was a Russian stooge, and you were going to hit forward or post on anything that kind of backed that up. And I think that with Trump, I mean, did Trump supporters, did they really believe that Obama was born in Kenya? They didn't care. It was a project of political delegitimization. And I actually think that is overwhelmingly how misinformation is produced and experienced and spread online. And the reason why we know about things like Russian disinformation is because the media reported on it. Actually, 90% of those posts were viewed by fewer than 10% of accounts. So none of us saw it organically. We saw it because we actually did their job for them by elevating it and having a big discussion about it. So I actually think the problem is a little bit overblown online and maybe underappreciated in other places. But I mean, cable news and talk radio are much more powerful vectors of misinformation than social media.
Yeah, and I also think, in a lot of our work with different communities addressing disinformation, we're also seeing that a lot more of it is happening in sort of private chat groups and WhatsApp conversations with families than it is on the social media platforms at this point. I don't think that's actually sort of the key point of virality at this point either, but because you cited—
Thanksgiving dinner. I point to Thanksgiving. We've got to stamp that out.
Also because you cited misinformation research, it's important to notice that also all of this is also happening at the same time as you're having a real political sort of campaign to silence and intimidate people doing research on misinformation. And you've had lawsuits and subpoenas and all sorts of things happening that has really kind of shut down and chilled the entire world of disinformation research, which makes it much harder for us to figure out the answers to a lot of these questions as well.
And why do you think it's more of a demand problem than a supply problem? I think because what the social media networks are doing and perfecting is they're getting closer. There's a convergence of the social media networks and just human nature. And so that's what we're like. We cotton to disinformation or misinformation if it flatters our worldview. I think that's absolutely true. So at the same time, is there, and I'm not talking about the current state, the current administration, but what is the path forward if we want to have some, is it A, possible, B, advisable, C, practical, to have some sort of effective anti-disinformation programs, or is this something we should be much more wary of than supportive of? What do you think?
We'd all say they can't be government programs, right? And I don't know if that's what you were getting at all, right? And if you're going to talk about government programs, we should exactly talk about this in this administration, because that's the whole point. With every kind of rule that you say that could put reasonable government limits on free speech, you have the decision maker problem. Who is going to actually be deciding what's information, what's disinformation? It's not going to be your favorite NPR host. It's not going to be Scott Simon of Weekend Edition. It's going to be Donald Trump's Justice Department that is deciding what is misinformation and what's fake news, right? And so anything that you make a government regulation is going to be enforced by somebody who is your political adversary. And that is why, I mean, basically, we don't let the government evaluate the truth or falsity of political claims. The Supreme Court has said lies are generally constitutionally protected. There are lies that are not. If you commit fraud against someone that deprives them of their property, if you have a false claim on a medical product that harms them.
Right.
But
Some
those
advertising claims.
Yeah, but those are cases where we do trust decision makers. We don't think that the FDA is going to be out to harm Americans. But if you're talking about political claims, it's going to be a political actor who's adjudicating it. And we really, really don't want to have government actors, partisan government actors, in the role of deciding what political claims are true or false.
Good, you go ahead.
No, I mean, I was just going to say yes. I mean, I think we definitely all agree we don't want government making decisions or making laws around addressing disinformation directly. But I do think there are also, our approach has always been that it shouldn't be about that. We don't want disinformation to become an excuse for policies or laws that shut down speech. So what you need to do is address sort of the affirmative aspect of it. And I do think there can be a role for figuring out what that can look like. You know, I mean, this is not really a Penn issue, but my personal feeling is that the way we consume information has completely transformed in the last 2 decades, and we've done absolutely nothing to adjust our education system or how we educate young people to reflect that at all. And so I think there's sort of just a digital media literacy and information literacy piece of this that is huge and is dramatically under appreciated and given little attention. And sure, there might be a government role for that because it's a question of curriculum and different things, but that's to me, that's quite different, I think, than, the sort of the threats that we would see from the government being in any position to decide what is disinformation and what is not.
We don't want governmental decrees suppressing speech, but during the next pandemic, do we want government officials jawboning social media companies where there's a lot of incorrect information that could kill millions of people? Do we say, well, if we allowed Fauci to do it, that got a lot of blowback. Now RFK Jr.'s in charge. We don't want him to be jawboning social media companies. That to me is a clear line. We could just say, no, it doesn't matter. People could say whatever they want about vaccines. I kind of doubt.
The government did a pretty bad job of it in the last pandemic.
I
Even
agree.
with the good administration. I mean, first they said, don't wear masks, right? And they said it's not airborne. Wash surfaces. And they said you can't. It's disinformation if you say that it was a lab leak. I mean, you really don't want government putting that kind of finger on the scale. I mean, science develops through hypothesis, refutation, and someone's right. I mean, how long ago was it that we thought that the way to deal with a fever was to, take out a pint of blood or something, right? I mean, like medical claims that were very, very orthodox and believed by everybody are proven wrong constantly. And so I think that's a perfect example of where you don't want the government saying, this is the truth, and all the speech that raises, even if there is some cost to it. And again, let's acknowledge this again. There is a cost to having an open society. Yes, some people are going to read that they should inject the wrong thing into themselves, and they're going to be harmed by that.
Really, anything I would say, just don't inject things into. Yeah, no, I agree. My esteemed panel of First Amendment scholars, I'm glad you agree. I think most of the people who you went to law school with and work in your circles, if they work in public health, would say, no, we have to do what we can to tell the people that the vaccines are safe, they're not going to kill you. Not taking the vaccines and believing this misinformation has so many more costs. And we won't suppress speech, but we will do a little jawboning, we will do a little convincing.
Oh, well, if they're not suppressing speech, I mean, that's fine. Like, I don't think any of us are arguing that they shouldn't.
But Zuckerberg
be able
objected to
put-
it. Zuckerberg said during the last pandemic, I got pressure. There was no law, but I got pressure to take down certain posts.
The thing is, the Supreme Court in that case never got to the merits of the question of whether or not the communications from the agencies crossed the line into unconstitutional coercion of the platform. So
Do you think they did?
Yes, I think at least in some
Most
those
of them
examples-
didn't. Most of them didn't. No, I mean, because we actually
saying-
do.
I'm saying at
Yeah,
least in
there were a
some.
handful, but
I
we
think-
do want government officials to share their expertise with the
they're
platforms.
not.
Right? What we would say is we want them to do it in public. They should stand up in front of a microphone and do it.
Yeah.
What they shouldn't do is have an FBI agent that goes to the company and quietly says, "Take this thing down." Right.
And so the
Because sunlight's the best disinfectant, not ivermectin.
I don't think sunlight cures COVID either, but
that was actually contested, wasn't it? Yeah.
yeah, but you should be allowed to say that if you want.
I think Bobby Kennedy's running mate thinks it does, but yeah.
So the DOJ, I think though, the Department of Justice, I think, is sort of learning its lesson a little bit. They did issue this guidance over the summer, I think, about how to communicate with the platforms and how to ensure that those communications aren't crossing that First Amendment line. And so like one example would be that when they're communicating, just to make it crystal clear, we're not requiring you to do one thing or another, right? We might be providing advice or information, our best known information that we currently have about this rapidly evolving communicable disease. But ultimately, it's your choice to decide what to do with it. And I
Yeah.
think that would raise far fewer concerns and probably wouldn't be a First Amendment violation. I think but to your question about I think the institutions still have to be very careful, though, because it's also an issue of trust, right? And going back to that point about all the advice that you want to give and for people to take, you need to have trust from the populace. And if they see you saying one thing and then, suggesting that nobody can say anything to the contrary, or that platforms shouldn't allow people to say anything to the contrary, and then it turns out you're wrong.
Yeah.
Well, the next time you come and try and say something, people are going to be like, well, last time you did this, and then you turned out to be wrong, so why should we listen to you now? So I think they need to be careful about that. And the thing about not allowing people to challenge or contest your ideas is that that's the way that we know that something is ultimately true.
That's a tell,
close
right?
To the truth, right?
Yeah.
Is that it's gone through that public testing and criticism
right.
and still emerge on the other side relatively unscathed.
Someone last point on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think we all agree. We don't want them to be job owning, and the line isn't always super clear, but I don't think the solution is to say you can't have any communication between government and the platforms, because
Even
that also...
private?
Yeah, I think so. Again, you can have guidelines, you can have good best practices for how to do that in a way that, stays far from the line, but I think it's risky to say that there can't be any of those communications. There's all sorts of reasons for, research purposes, all types of reasons why you might want some of that conversation to go on, and I think the free speech executive order, which, I think essentially is talking about all of these efforts to address disinformation as censorship, is written in such a way that it could chill a lot of government activity, even sort of coordination with other governments potentially. And so I think that there's some risk there too.
It was also interesting that the executive order said we're going to investigate the previous 4 years of Joe
Not
Biden.
5 years.
It actually started under the Trump administration,
yes.
whether or not he personally approved of it, but it did not start on January 20th, 2021.
Right. So the Trump administration, the past Trump administration, the Trump candidacy, extremely belligerent to media, calling media the enemy of the people, creating, I think, a dangerous situation, certainly often an inaccurate situation. He's entitled to his views. He's not entitled to passing laws. He should not be able to intimidate members of the media. But my question for you is the media somewhat to blame in that they don't even seem to be sticking up for themselves? When sued by Donald Trump, they have, in the case of Disney and ABC, paid him off for a case that, well, you guys are the experts, but I know of no legal expert who said that Stephanopoulos and ABC were liable for his description of Trump as a rapist as opposed to a sexual assaulter. And yet he won that case. And there are recent reports in Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal that CBS is considering settling with Trump for his suit because he didn't like how promos of a 60-minute segment showed Kamala Harris giving one answer instead of another. Trump, I don't even know how he's an interested party in this, sued for $10 billion, and the reporting is that he could very well get some money because CBS has decided we have other business in front of the government, like our merger, our Paramount merger, and so we don't want this interference. So I want you to take this where you will, but let's just address this question. Is the media, in playing these games and maybe paying off Donald Trump, doing enough to stand up for itself? What do you think?
I think the danger here, this is showing the danger of having a consolidated corporate media. When important news organizations are owned by massive corporations that do a ton of various kinds of business with an administration that has shown itself to be vindictive, they're going to follow what their incentives are. And so it might have been very smart for Disney to settle that case, even though it was very stupid for ABC to settle that case. It might be very smart for Viacom to settle a case, even though it's very dumb for CBS to do that. And it may be funny that the Washington Post changed its slogan, but on the one hand you could say, look, they're owned by one of the richest people in the world. He's uniquely capable of standing up against the government. That should be a good thing. In practice, that is not the way that it has been playing out. And so I think it really underscores how important it's going to be for the media organizations that don't have those sort of tangled business connections with the government to be louder and more credible. I don't really know what the solution is to this. We can all yell at ABC and Disney, right?
But it's also always been ever thus, right? Our media organizations are owned by extremely rich people who have business interests in all sort of realms, from the Boston Globe owning the Red Sox to, the Hearst Corporation and all of its business interests. But what do you think about what I asked, or anything else about what Trump and the media, if they're on a collision course that threatens free speech?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, sort of setting the specifics of any one case aside, I think that the kind of collective of things we've seen even just over the past few months, these legal cases, but then also, the Washington Post and the LA Times declining to endorse a candidate, the refusal to publish this political cartoon in the Washington Post a couple of weeks ago. Again, we don't necessarily know what the truth is behind all of these exactly, but I think the sort of optics of all of that is really concerning, because it does send a message at a moment when trust in the media is already a really deep issue in this country, of sort of conceding in advance, right? Which is also something that we see in, a sort of warning sign of authoritarianism in other countries as well, where you sort of have this obeying in advance tendency, which I think we are seeing in some of these cases too. So I think the optics and the message that it sends are concerning, and I think it is important for the outlets that can, again, to be robust, to be strong, and not to to think about the kind of signal that this sends and what it does to trust in the media. And I think the idea that the using the lack of trust in the media as an excuse to not engage in the endorsement, which I think was part of what Bezos said about the Post,
Right.
was very just kind of perverse to me, because I think that's certainly not how you address that problem.
Yeah,
Right?
or you at
But they
least
will
do
have
it a
their-
year earlier.
They will have their fingers in the wind. It may be that Trump is at the very height of his powers right now. That's the optimistic scenario, which is right now he is acting like he won a landslide. Everyone is kissing the ring. And it may be that in 3 or 6 months, he's quite politically unpopular. And then I think you will see a shift in how some of these news organizations are reacting to these threats. And he also may go far over the line in some of his legal responses. I mean, now the FCC just announced that it's reopened its investigation of ABC for bias in the debate.
And CBS, and there was a third one too. Three completely frivolous
Yeah.
FCC complaints are all filed by the same organization,
Yeah.
ironically called the Center for American Rights.
Yeah.
And
If there is no ability to say there's no evidence that Haitians ate dogs and cats, if you are held liable for that, what is free speech and free expression?
yeah, I mean, so the FCC chair, I mean, he's signaled every intention to basically crack down on media outlets that are critical of the current administration. And
And is the
it's
point
not
to do it, or
FCC's
is there
role.
some other point? Is there some other bank shop point? Like with these suits, Trump wanted essentially a shakedown and he got his money. Is there some other point to threatening the media?
Chill.
Back page.
Chill
Yeah.
is the point. But I think some of these cases, the FCC in particular, if this stuff gets to the Supreme Court, I don't think that the Trump administration is going to win.
Right.
The Supreme Court's pretty strong.
But what about
Right.
Sullivan, right? So explain how important that is, and if that ruling might be reversed, which has protected the media for years.
I actually don't think anybody really thinks that the New York Times versus Sullivan is going to be reversed. And this is the Supreme Court decision that makes it very difficult to go after the media for defamation, because if they're writing about a public figure, you have to demonstrate that they did so with actual malice, and malice doesn't mean ill intent, it means with reckless disregard from the truth. You either knew that it was a lie, or you absolutely should have known that it was a lie, and it's a very, very media protective standard that you don't have, for example, in the UK, where the media has to prove truth. Here you just have to prove reasonable diligence. I think Sullivan's been cited in a bunch of recent Supreme Court cases by majorities, and so I think there are a couple of justices on the Supreme Court who would like to see it go and would like to see defamation cases subject to a more lenient standard. The problem with defamation cases, of course, is not just who wins, but that they have to be defended. And so, I mean, you see Trump. I mean, Fire is representing an Iowa pollster who published a poll that said that Trump might lose Iowa. He's not going to win. The Trump campaign is not going to win that lawsuit, but the fact that she has to defend it and that Fire's resources have to go into defending it, the intent there is to communicate to smaller news outlets that might not have big budgets for defending these cases. If you write something that the president and his people don't like, you're going to have to defend a lawsuit.
Yeah, the lawsuit itself is the punishment.
So tell me about Ann Seltzer and the Des Moines Register. And
Yeah, she's a well-known Iowa pollster
Yeah.
who this time around predicted, I think a couple days before the election, that Kamala Harris was going to win Iowa by like 3 points, and then she ended up losing. And it was, it was a prediction that surprised everybody because Iowa has been a reliably red state as of late.
And Ann Seltzer is the greatest pollster
And
alive.
she's- right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
And then Trump ended up winning Iowa handily, and of course won the entire election. But
It's actually Democrats who should sue her for the emotional distress, right? That she
Is
caused.
there a false hope tort?
That's what I'm saying.
well, yeah, I think I mean this is a little bit beside the point, but I think it is arguable who that actually benefited in the election, because you could argue that it actually it caused Republicans to be like, oh, I
Listen, I listened to Dan
I gotta
Bongino's.
get out there and vote.
I
because
listened
it's
to
not
Dan
a fair
Bongino's show, and it led the show. You got to get out there. Ann Seltzer is saying.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, I mean that's debatable both ways. But so Trump is now suing Ann Seltzer. The Des Moines Register published the poll, and the theory, and this is kind of a concerning trend now, I think in the world of free speech. He's claiming it's consumer fraud, and it's not. Consumer fraud, we touched on a little bit earlier. It's something like the example we gave is the car salesman rolls back the odometer on the car. You buy the car thinking it only had 10,000 miles on it or whatever. You were deceived, and you suffered some material loss based on that concrete, easily ascertainable lie, right? This is much different. It's making a prediction about an election, right? Predictions by their nature may end up being right or wrong, and you have a First Amendment right to be wrong in your prediction about something. It's just like you can't sue the weatherman because he said there was a 90% chance of rain tomorrow and it didn't end up raining. So it's a completely frivolous suit, but to go back to that point earlier, the lawsuit itself is a punishment, and the problem is Iowa is one of these states that doesn't have what's called an anti-SLAPP law that a lot of other states do have, and they're basically these laws that facilitate the quick and early dismissal of frivolous defamation suits so that the defendant doesn't have to go through the time and expense of defending them. But we're representing Seltzer in this suit, and hopefully we can get it dismissed quickly. But this idea of this is not the only lawsuit or law that's an example of trying to repackage speech as something other than speech, right? Consumer fraud, these lawsuits against social media companies that under a products liability theory, which is usually something like, like a defective buzzsaw or
Right.
something, but they claim because you're allowing this speech or these features on your platform, it's a dangerous product. It's definitely something a trend to watch.
So I want to have time for questions, but also I want to pull back and ask, do you think that the people who care and think about speech still subscribe to, is it the Brandeis Rule in 1927? He essentially said the way to combat objectionable speech is more speech. I think from the layman's perspective, or someone who reads the New York Times or talks to some people, there was a theory, there was a growing discontent with that notion. And it could be phrased as, that's nice, it's from an earlier time, and now speech has become so weaponized, you can't just combat bad speech with more speech. You have to either address it as disinformation, or I don't know, maybe sue the hell out of it, or something. We're no longer living in a combat bad speech with more speech era. I don't know. What do the experts such as yourself think about that? A, is that the ideal? And B, do you think the cognoscenti has soured on that ideal as a member, as a cognoscenta? What do you think? Summer.
I mean, I do still think that's the ideal, of course. I would say that I think the social media platforms do complicate that ideal because you're not just having a sort of open, even conversation. Some things are being amplified in different ways. And I do think that, the way that we've done a lot of work on online abuse and the impact it has on journalists and writers. And that is, a way in which speech that is protected, and much of which, we're not necessarily saying should be taken down, but it is itself silencing, right? It drives people, we did research years ago that said journalists were getting offline, not reporting on certain topics, leaving the profession altogether because of the abuse they were experiencing. So, I do think that there are these ways in which it is a complicated environment we're in right now. I still don't think that means that you want to give the government or, ideally even corporations, these major tech platforms, more power to adjudicate, our speech, because that is just a slippery slope. So, but I do, I think that the dynamic and the debates around these issues in society have gotten very complicated. I do think the commitment to a principled defense of free speech is a much sort of harder case to make these days. And I think that, there's, I think maybe in part because a younger generation has come up experiencing a lot of what happens on the platforms that is pretty awful. I think there, is much more of a willingness. I think we see a willingness across the spectrum to shut down speech that people disagree with, whether that's, the book bans that we're seeing, or desire to cancel certain speakers on campuses, or, whatever it is. I think there is less of a willingness to engage with different ideas and to engage in that difficult conversation. People are increasingly in their bubbles, and anything that's not in that bubble makes them uncomfortable, and it's harder to get people to really be open to having those conversations across difference, and I think that's something that we feel as an organization we're committed to. We think that, that's a role that literature and writers can play, because the whole point of, reading and literature is about building empathy and understanding and putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, and that is a way to sort of open up some of those spaces. But I think it's definitely a really challenging moment for that.
Yeah, I encourage everyone to read a book about the history of free speech by Jacob Mushangama. Full disclosure, he's a FIRE senior fellow, but it's a great book. It goes through the whole history of free speech. And one thing you realize reading that book is that these arguments actually aren't new at all. You go back to the invention of the printing press, and you'll see the same panic about, the spread of fake news, although they use that term, but right, the spread of false news and scandalous news, and just all these, we're just unleashing this torrent of ideas and information on the populace, and the people in authority and the elites have no control over it, right? And it's just a recurrent theme, particularly whenever you have any kind of technological advancement in communications technology. You had it again after the telegraph, after the invention of the radio, after the invention of the TV, the internet, and now with social media and artificial intelligence. And I think one thing to remember too is that we're still very early in the history of social media and AI. And so there is always like an initial very disruptive period where we're trying to figure things out. But on a historical time scale, we're very early. It's only been about 25 years that we've had social media. It's not very long on a historical time scale. And I think we've adapted in the past to these new technologies, and we now look back at them as net goods.
Yes.
And I'm confident that we will do the same with the internet and social media and AI in the future. But yeah, there's always going to be work to do with kind of shifting cultural norms and attitudes and finding ways to make dialogue more productive. But the most important thing to remember is that the alternative to the more speech approach is to have some dominant ruling power or centralized authority make decisions, right, about what is and isn't acceptable to say. And that's always going to be a more dangerous road to go down.
Ben.
To your point, I do think that there is more disdain for this idea of a marketplace of ideas being the way that we work it out. It's a distorted marketplace. To which I would say, what marketplace is not distorted, right? Why are we picking on speech? Look, I still believe that people can change their minds. I changed my mind many times over the last decade. There was an incredible piece some years ago in the New Yorker about Megan Phelps Roper, who grew up in the Westboro Baptist Church, or maybe I should say ACLU client Westboro Baptist Church, right? She spent her childhood in an extremist religious community that was protesting military funerals. And it was actually being on social media and arguing with people that opened up her worldview and changed her into the incredibly thoughtful person that she is. And that's maybe an outlier story, but we have to insist on that possibility, that people will be confronted by things that they haven't been confronted before. And that will actually change who they are and what they believe. So yeah, it's an imperfect marketplace. Some people have more power than other people. Some people's voices are louder than others. That has always been true. It was true when Brandeis wrote that, and maybe it's more true now, but I don't see an alternative. And just one final point here, which is that even if people were not changing their minds or being persuaded, I would still insist on the right of free speech. If we believe in freedom of conscience, we believe in freedom of speech. Your right to believe something has no meaning if you can't say it. And even if everybody thinks you're wrong, and even if no one is persuaded by it, and even if people are offended by it, I still think that you have a right to believe it and a right to say it.
What have you changed your mind on in the last hour? Who won?
But I thought that, I mean, I think the exhibit downstairs is wonderful, and I do think, to me, like, free speech is the lifeblood of a democratic and diverse and dynamic society, and that's the society I want to live in, at least. And I think it is the society most people want to live in, and it does come with trade-offs. It's not an easy thing to be committed to. I thought the cartoon of the umbrella with everybody saying, can it not cover them and pointing at each other? I mean, that is the reality of how people feel about it, right? Free speech for me, but not for thee. But I think if you really, it is a thing that if you want it to be available for everybody, you have to be willing to defend it for everybody.
So maybe we have a couple minutes where someone can have the opportunity to change one of our minds, and you win free membership to the museum. If you do, I'm not authorized to give that, but okay, I'm getting the nod. We have a question over there. Go ahead.
Hi, guys. Thanks for the really great discussion. It was great to hear all of you. You guys have, in relation to talking about X and Facebook and other kind of social media platforms, used language like free press or editorial discretion or whatever, but these places are not, according to Section 230, publishers per se, and they don't have to comport with the same kinds of things that a publisher would. So I am curious both how Section 230 and also Citizens United changes the free speech conversation around corporations, and what you think about the prospects of either of these two things changing at any time in the next decade.
Okay. Do any of you think the platform should be regulated as publishers?
I think you have to kind of clarify a couple points here. So social media platforms are publishers in the First Amendment sense. Yes. In that, like a newspaper, they are literally publishing content, including third-party content. So they have even if you imagine Section 230 doesn't exist, they have a First Amendment right to do that. Now, what Section 230 does is basically change the liability regime where the platforms are, under that statute, are not liable for third-party content that they in no way contributed to the potential unlawfulness of it.
Which is the vast majority of
right, so if I defame you,
yes.
Which I would never do, Mike, on Twitter.
Well, you couldn't on Twitter, right?
You could sue me as the speaker, but you couldn't sue Twitter. And the rationale behind that law is that these platforms are huge, right? They host an enormous amount of user-generated content, and they allow users to just post things without any prior review. And it just would be completely unrealistic for them to be able to stay on top of all the content on their platforms and make sure that no one's posting anything unlawful. And so if you didn't have 230, they'd be constantly dragged into court to defend these lawsuits based on what individual users say. And then it probably wouldn't be financially viable for them to even continue to operate as platforms that host user-generated content. And we really wouldn't have not only social media, but it also applies to other websites that host user content like Yelp, Wikipedia, like dating sites even. All those get the protection of 230. And it's really important if we want to have the internet that we currently have. And to answer your question about whether it's under threat, I think it is actually, because in 2020, President Trump issued an executive order that would require, would basically eliminate Section 230 immunity for platforms that don't moderate in a neutral way, which would cause a lot of problems, including, I think, a First Amendment problem to impose that kind of requirement on the platforms. I keep bringing up the FCC chair, but he has also endorsed this same idea, even though it's actually outside of his jurisdiction to be regulating social media platforms. So there is concern about that, although I don't know. There have also been bipartisan attempts to try and reform Section 230 for years, a couple of which have actually been successful, but they haven't. The left and the right want to reform it for different reasons, and maybe that's part of the reason that Congress hasn't successfully been able to get that package through and completely abolish it, at least.
Yeah, but I mean, I think the idea of completely abolishing it would completely transform the internet as we know it, and I don't know if it's just like willful refusal to recognize that from some of the policymakers who seem interested in that, but that seems untenable to me. But I do think there's definitely some risk at this point.
By the way, the comment section of the NewYorkTimes.com, is that regulated under 230?
Yeah, so even if you're a traditional print publisher, Section 230 applies to you as to your website, your online.
They treat you like the telephone company. You can't sue AT&T for someone giving a threat over the phone. Any other questions?
Yes, wanted to ask about artificial intelligence a little bit. The reports about all of the chatbot content that's on a lot of the social media sites. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it at the more extreme is, do artificial intelligence entities have free speech rights?
I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. I think there's three ways that you could think about a large language, an LLM AI program having free speech rights. You could say, I think the easiest way is you'd say the person who creates the program is the one who has free speech rights. You could say somehow the program itself should be subject to some kind of First Amendment analysis. But I think the easiest way to think about it is that readers have free speech rights. We have a right to receive, and this is what we were talking about in the context of TikTok and propaganda. So it's very clear that the advent of chatbots and LLMs, it's not going to be occurring outside of the context of the First Amendment. So one context that has already come up is what happens when one of these programs defames you. Right? I don't think it's going to be protected by Section 230, right, in the same way that Facebook would be, because someone actually created the program, right? So, there may be elements of the defamation claim that are hard to prove, which is that it was published somewhere, that you were harmed by it, but I do think we're going to start to see a whole body of First Amendment law develop around those chatbots.
Has that happened to any of you, by the way? Have you been defamed by a chatbot AI yet?
If so, I don't know it, and therefore I wasn't defamed.
A thing happened to me like that. It kept saying I was married to someone who wasn't my wife, and I swear I wasn't married to her. I looked her up. She seemed like a nice lady, but I didn't know. Not as nice as my wife, but I didn't know who to sue. Any other questions? I mean, you're free to speak. There we go.
Hi. I know you touched briefly on Morse v. Frederick at the very beginning, but I wanted to know if you guys had any additional thoughts on how student speech and campus speech will change with this upcoming administration.
It's good. I had a campus speech portion I didn't get to, but let's get to it. Go ahead.
You want to take it first?
Fire. The E used to be education.
Well, I should say that I actually, all my ambit of fire is completely off-campus work, but I can still speak to it. We were the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education for about the first 20 years of our existence, and just expanded off-campus a few years ago. I think that there are some things to be concerned about in the next few years under this administration, trends that have actually already started even before Trump took the presidency, but we've seen since October 7th, for example, a lot of crackdowns on speech, and interestingly, weaponization of Title VI, which prohibits discrimination against groups based on various protected statuses. And it's been used to try and crack down on pro-Palestinian speech as speech that is constitutes anti-Semitic discrimination. So trying to hold, there have been a lot of lawsuits against universities trying to hold them liable for allowing this discriminatory environment on campus. And I think this goes to show, this goes to show how certain rationales that initially are used by one side to try and censor speech will then end up being used as a weapon by the other side. Because we've seen for many years how there have been censorship on campus because it offends, because it's considered offensive to people of a particular identity group. And now we see that being used against pro-Palestinian protesters. And so it's concerning that Harvard, for example, just adopted the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition of anti-Semitism that to use to adjudicate these complaints. And it's something that we've at FIRE been raising concern about for years, because it adopts this very broad definition of anti-Semitism that can include political criticisms of the state of Israel.
I'll read some of it. This is what.
Sure, yeah.
So Harvard had an FAQ, and what happened? They were sued under Title VI, and as you're saying, Aaron, obviously Jewish students who are aggrieved by their perception that you could say anything against them at a time when 2, 3, 4 years earlier their speech was being curtailed are going to take advantage of Title VI. And Harvard writes, and this is in their official FAQs as part of a settlement, for many Jewish people, Zionism is a part of their Jewish identity. Conduct that would violate the non-discrimination policy of targeting Jewish or Israeli people can also violate the policy if directed towards Zionists. Examples of such conduct include excluding Zionists from an open event, calling for the death of Zionists, applying a no-Zionist litmus test for participation in any Harvard activity, using or disseminating tropes, stereotypes, or conspiracies about Zionists, or demanding a person who is perceived to be Jewish or Israeli to state a position on Israel or Zionism to harass or discriminate. And many members of their faculty said, make no mistake, this will chill the discussion about Zionism. If you have a rule that says you can't criticize a Zionist, which is a political position, you're essentially saying you have a rule that says you can't get into full debate.
Exactly. And look, there might be instances where someone can make the argument. It's not saying you can't, that it can never be sort of a cloak for anti-Semitism. But by the way, anti-Semitic speech, absent more, is also protected by the First Amendment.
By the First Amendment, but not under the rules of these colleges.
Right. Well, the private colleges can set their own rules, but private colleges like Harvard also aspire to be bastions of free thought and free inquiry, where they, adopt something close to, or profess to adopt something close to First Amendment standards.
Yes. But they definitely do have speech codes about other classes, other marginalized groups. So now they're applying it to Zionists or Israelis. Or
right. And the argument we tried to make since October 7th is basically don't level down by censoring more speech against more groups, rather level up by allowing free speech and only punishing discriminatory harassment when it actually rises to the level of something severe, pervasive, it meets the definition that the Supreme Court set for that. But I think also one thing that I wouldn't want to see more of is the type of hearings that were happening with the college presidents, where they were being browbeat about not doing enough to deal with quote-unquote calls for genocide on campus and other speech deemed anti-Semitic. And again, you can understand frustration with double standards at some of these schools because of the way that they punished other speech in the past. But the answer isn't, again, the answer is to protect free speech for everyone and not have double standards. It's even something like calls for genocide, right, could be interpreted very broadly to include students chanting from the river to the sea, which there's a lot of argument about what that phrase actually means. And in an environment that's supposed to be dedicated to open debate and allowing a wide diversity of perspectives, we should allow those debates to happen, and colleges shouldn't be cracking down on that sort of speech, again, if it doesn't actually rise to the level of true harassment.
You guys want to take a slice of the college question?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I would just say, first of all, I mean, we've actually seen a lot of really concerning things happening in the higher education speech over the last 4 years at the state level as well, right? We've seen legislation passed in states around the country that restricts what can be talked about and discussed in classrooms, both in the K through 12 and higher ed space. And we've also seen a lot of the sort of job owning and intimidation, putting pressure on schools to, not teach certain issues, to do away with their DEI departments and programs. And so, I do think that we're, if you look at some of the language in some of the executive orders that we've seen, echo a lot of that we've been seeing at the state level too. And so I do think that we're going to, I think higher ed is going to continue to be under a lot of pressure. And I think it's very concerning, and combined with the sort of congressional hearings, I think there's a real sense in the community that they are very much at the center of this. And so I think, again, the kind of chilling effect feels significant. And I think we're hearing that honestly across sectors that I think is worrisome from, not this one obviously, but museums that are thinking about putting off more controversial exhibits until, maybe not this year, or we're talking to playwrights who are worried that theaters might not be willing to put on more cutting edge plays. And, I think a lot of institutions, with all of this sort of political pressure, lawsuits, retaliatory approaches that we've been seeing from a lot of political actors, it's having a broader chilling effect where people are thinking twice about kind of what they're doing. And I think that really seeps in at a lot of levels. And I think I definitely worry about campuses in particular.
I would just add, just so it doesn't sound all doom and gloom, I do think there have been some positive developments too, and I'm actually not sure if we would agree on all these, but like, for example, FIRE came out, I think a year ago or so, in support of universities adopting institutional neutrality, meaning that the administration and leadership will not be taking positions on hot button social and political issues. And we think that's a good thing because
unless it directly affects their
yes, there is an exception for something that directly affects the operation and functioning of the university. We think that creates the best possible climate for there to be free and open expression by students and faculty, and that the Calvin report, which is kind of the gold star for institutional neutrality, has this line in there about the university is not the critic itself, it is the sponsor of critics. The unit of dissent is the student and the faculty member. So a lot of universities have been adopting institutional neutrality. Now, you could argue that some of it's kind of you can look at it in a cynical way, where it's that they just wanted to avoid having to say things about Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But if they actually stay true to it going forward on other issues, I think that's a good thing. And then on the DEI issue, there's concerning aspects of it where, FIRE, for example, filed a lawsuit against the Stop Woke Act in Florida, which affected which controlled what type of topics and viewpoints professors could espouse in the classroom related to topics like race and gender, and just a clear, obvious violation of academic freedom. But another lawsuit that we filed in California was against a community college system that requires faculty to be evaluated based on their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we also view that, and that's something that's common at a lot of colleges and universities where they require these DEI statements. We view that as an infringement on academic freedom too, because in one case in Florida, you're banning speech about these issues, and then in a lot of these other schools, you're requiring professors to endorse or adopt certain viewpoints about DEI, and that sort of compelled adoption of an ideology is equally an infringement of academic freedom. But we're starting to see more pushback against those sorts of requirements, which I think is also a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I think we agree on the DEI stuff. we also oppose the sort of mandated statements, and I think that I think the DEI issue is one where, yes, there are cases where DEI programs or policies have stepped across into either mandating positions or, saying these are words you can't use, or things that, do have concerns from a free expression perspective. But this approach to address, any even remote flaws or ways in which these programs might, warrant some thought and reform by banning them outright is clearly, not the solution and not the way to not the way to approach it by shutting down an entire area of thought and inquiry. So.
Well, we have been talking about speech, which seems natural, but you have been listening, which is, of course, the essential component, and we thank you for doing that, and I'd like you to join me in thanking Ben, Summer, and Aaron for being excellent panelists. Thank you so much. Thank you for the National Liberty Museum. And now, a word from the president.
Really quickly, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't invite you back to the museum. Thank you for being great participants. Again, thank you to our panelists and moderator. This was a lot of fun for me. Very proud kind of museum CEO moment. So a couple of things just so you guys know. For February 6th, we're actually having another reception for our next exhibition opening called Word Powered. Would love to have you guys come. We'll send a follow-up email and invite you guys all to that. We'll be launching, if you saw our lovely bartender downstairs, Sean, we're launching a new event monthly, third Thursdays. He will be back every Thursday. We're going to have a lot of fun, more information on that. And then, ironically, you mentioned Jacob Misham-Gama, who will be at the museum March 27th in our partnership with with World Affairs Council, free speech and the press. So another great conversation. I'd love to invite you all back. I hope you had a great time. If you did, become a member as you leave. Thank you.
Thank you.